Hello, this is Ben, and what we're going to talk about in this video is not the question of where babies come from, but rather the question of where babies go when they die. You know, not where they come from when they come into life, but what happens after they leave this life. This is a question that a lot of people ask, a lot of teenagers ask, a lot of pastors will have an answer on their website. It's actually a quite common question, especially for Christians, especially for people who have this belief in heaven and hell. And then as Christians, we believe that the way you go to heaven is you place your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Well, a little baby, how do they place their faith and trust in Jesus Christ? How can they do that? Okay, now that's a clear and obvious question. Like, what in the world do we do with that? A lot of people have a lot of answers. We're going to look at some of the answers and why they're bad. And we're going to try to answer the question, but we're going to answer it in a very odd way. This question is bigger than just babies. There's an added question of people who simply live their entire life and never hear about Jesus. So the message of Jesus wasn't really spread until Jesus came to this earth, and it's clear that no one really seemed to understand it. So what about all the people that lived and died before Jesus? And then what about all the people that live and die even after the time of Jesus, even all the way up to today, who never hear about Jesus? Where do they go? They can't. How could they even have the option of placing their faith and trust in Jesus? And so the reason we're going to bring up this question is to answer it, you have to deal with like so many side points that I realized, you know what? This is just a great topic to like teach a whole bunch of things in a really tightly packed way. The only question is, like, we're going to probably cover in this video perhaps some things you've never heard of. Who knows, you know? I don't know who's going to be watching, but I've got a theory that a lot of the time when I cover something that someone doesn't understand, the main reason they don't understand it is perhaps in some cases because people have made up their mind they don't like the conclusion that I've reached. Like if you're an atheist, you don't like a video that proves God exists and you just don't like it, and that's that. And then in many cases, the reason people have a problem with what I say is because there's a follow-up question. And so what I decided was, why don't we take advantage of that? And why don't we just make a point, prove a point, explain a point, and then I'm sure there's a follow-up question. Let's just jump to the follow-up question. And hopefully everybody will see that, this all fits tightly together. You may feel like it goes kind of fast for you, even though this video may take a long time, but we'll actually cover a lot of ground and move really fast. So let's just see how fast we can do it. Now, I assume people are familiar with the question. We've already introed the question, so let's just jump right to it. Heaven or hell? Do babies go to heaven or hell? And also, what about people in faraway places and that kind of thing who for some reason they never hear about Jesus, or maybe they live where they could have heard about Jesus, but for some odd turn of events they don't. This is called the problem of the unevangelized. When evangelism is spreading the good news of Jesus, the problem is, what about the people who they never heard the good news? Alright, so one response people give to this is called the age of accountability. And what they say is that if someone is not old enough to understand, if they're a baby, basically, and they die as a baby, they're not old enough to understand. So they're just allowed into heaven anyway. Now, there are numerous problems with the age of accountability. The basis that people try to find in the Bible is really, really slim, and it's not even worth bringing up. A major problem with it is it would suddenly become a good idea to kill every baby you can because they would go straight to heaven. So abortion would suddenly become the best thing ever. Because think about it, a person has no chance of going to hell if you kill them before they reach whatever you'd think the age of accountability is. But if you kill them, if you wait till they're old enough to have the age of accountability and they're old enough to make their own choice about whether or not they put their faith in Jesus, then they might go to hell. So like, if this was true, if the age of accountability thing was true, then it would make perfect sense for women to just get as many abortions as possible and just keep getting pregnant, keep getting abortions. And then the other problem is the age of accountability. It doesn't even deal at all with the people in faraway places. It just completely ignores that. I mean, should we kill all them too? Should we just bomb, carpet bomb nations and nuke nations where we think the gospel hasn't spread? Because, I mean, there are a lot of people who come out of a lot of nations, like Michael Ramsden, for example, is a Christian apologist who grew up until I think he was 16 in basically, I think he said Saudi Arabia, and he said until he was 16 and he moved to Cyprus, he said he just never heard about Jesus. Okay, and then another problem is, of course, the Bible verses that contradict it. So, like, John 14:6 says, Jesus said to them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And so this is a problem because if the age of accountability thing is saying the reason they go to heaven is because they're just not able to know about Jesus, and therefore they're not held responsible for Jesus, for placing their faith and trust in Jesus, then there's like another way into heaven. So Jesus would say, no one comes to the Father but by me, or they come in this other way. The ones that can't know about me. And so, like, what some people do with that verse in this age of accountability thing is they say, well, those people are still coming through Jesus. It's just like Jesus' forgiveness is extended to them. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. They're not placing their faith and trust in Jesus. Okay? Let's see. So they don't know. These kids don't even know about Jesus. Let's see. Now, if some people respond to this question by saying that all babies and all people in faraway places and all the unevangelized, they all go to hell. Then you have other problems. There are people who say this. They just solve it that way. They say, we're born sinful, we're born in sin, we have a sinful nature, and so everyone goes to hell. First problem with this is that God sent Jesus, which is a pretty strong indication that he wants people to be saved from hell and go to heaven. So, like, that's a major problem with that theory. Okay, so, like, for example, Romans 5:8 says, for God demonstrates his own kind of love towards us in this, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. I mean, it seems as clear as possible that God doesn't want people to go to hell. And so it doesn't make any sense to think that, like, people go to hell simply because they just don't know. That, like, why would God allow that? That would essentially be a God who doesn't care. Then we've got verses like this one in 2 Peter 3, verse 9. It's a famous one, of course. As soon as I start reading it, you're going to say, oh, I heard that before. It says, well, we'll start verse 8. 2 Peter 3:8 says, but do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. So, there you have it. That couldn't be any more clear. Okay, now another bad answer people give to this is people say, well, there is no such thing as hell, and it's universal salvation for all. So this is like, I oftentimes speak of this as like Oprah's position, because it is her position. It's called perennialism. It's an idea that, like, all religions really, at the core, when they started, they were all teaching the same thing, and over time they deviated, and then some new religious figure arose, like Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and they arose and discovered the same teaching that the previous guy did, and then reinstilled it in everyone, and then that fell away. So that's the idea that all religions teach the same thing and they don't contradict one another. The problem with perennialism is, of course, there's no evidence for this, like, this perennial teaching. I mean, how do people like Oprah have the light and the rest of us don't? It's quite arrogant. That's one problem. They know the truth. What Jesus was really saying was not what the apostles and all the ancient historical documents that were written close to the time of Jesus say that he was saying. But it's really what Oprah knows, and the same goes for all the other religions. You can think of it this way, simple little way to put it. Jesus said that he is God. Muhammad says that Jesus is not God. Atheists say there is no God. Hindus say everyone is God, and Buddhists say God's not really important. You need to stop worrying about God. Okay. Big difference. Big difference. But the point is, like, the problem of the unevangelized leads a lot of people to say things like Muslims and Christians really believe the same thing. And so, like, they don't really believe the same thing. Muslims and Christians are probably the two most common religions in the world. But Muslims deny that Jesus is God, become one of us, that he died for our sins. They say he didn't even die at all, and they say that he never resurrected. So those are pretty important, vital things at the heart of Christianity. It's something they don't believe in. Okay, another question, a very simple question would be, like, well, if there's universal salvation for all, why aren't we all already in heaven? This is just kind of like a brain teaser, but, like, we won't delve into that. But, like, why are we even here in the first place? If we're all just going to go to heaven, why would we just go to heaven? There's Bible verses galore. Jesus. The verses that I've already given you. Like 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Which means, like, there's some sort of perishing. There's some sort of something that he's trying to get people to avoid. Or John 14:6, and Bible verses galore on that. We shouldn't even, So, like, one question would be, like, okay, well, why would a loving God create hell in the first place? Which is a simple question. Like, why would a loving God create hell? If God loves us, then he should force everyone to go to heaven. So, here's the thing. We're just going to go through this at high speed. Who is God really? Have you ever asked yourself, what does the word God mean? Well, if there was anything greater than God, then that would be God's God, wouldn't it? Because God would worship that thing and say that whatever that is greater than God. So for God to really be God, God would have to be the greatest thing there is. There would have to be nothing greater than God. So what that means is God is a thing of maximum greatness. God has every property of greatness maxed out. God has power maxed out. God has love maxed out. God has forgiveness maxed out. God has holiness, justice, mercy, everything maxed out. God would be the foundation of goodness itself, the most great and good thing that there is. Okay? And the cornerstone of existence. And anything that has any goodness so in other words, like, let's say you eat an apple and you say, oh, the apple's delicious. Well, why is that apple delicious? Where does the deliciousness of the apple, what is the origin of the deliciousness of the apple? It must come from God. Because if it doesn't come from God, then, like, we can imagine a greater God, right? Who is the creator of the deliciousness of the apple. And so what that would mean is, like, that would be God's God. God would sit there and say, man, I wish I was awesome as this other God. Even if the other God doesn't exist, God would still wish he was that God. So, like, the point is, God has to truly be God, he has to be goodness itself. The bedrock of all that is good. So, what that means is, when we do something evil, we're not just rejecting being good, we're rejecting God, because God is goodness. We're saying, everything you are, God, I don't want that, I don't want you in my life, get out of my life. And so, if that's really what we want, and God loves us enough to respect our decision, then God will get out of our life. And then, so therefore, a loving God would care about our choices, and our choices would matter to God, and God would take them seriously, and they would be meaningful and important to God. So a loving God would give us what we ask for. And so it's quite simple. The door to hell is locked from the inside. It's where you want to go if you want God out of your life. If you want to be, in other words, if you really love evil, then you get God out of your life. And to be separated from God is to be separated from goodness itself. It's a stupid choice, but I don't think any. I remember I watched the Superman and Batman movie, and Superman was sad. He said to Batman, "Whatever happened to the good villains?" And Batman said, "Well, tell me, what are good villains? You know, and so we could say it's a stupid choice, but it's a stupid choice every single one of us makes. And we're all familiar with it. Okay. So, there we go. Now, here's the question. Let's move on from these bad answers and let's try to formulate a good answer. Alright? Here's the question we need to address. Like, what if it's possible for everyone to hear about Jesus? That's really, if that's possible, then that would resolve the question, wouldn't it? Maybe there are no unevangelized. Okay, now you would say, well, to me, well, Ben, there has to be people who live their whole life and never hear about Jesus. I mean, how can a little baby even understand? How can people in a faraway country, they never heard about that? I mean, Michael Ramsden said until he was 16 years old living in Saudi Arabia, he'd never heard about it. Okay, well, let's back up that truck just a little bit and let's say, what exactly do people need to hear? What exactly is the message we're talking about that people need to hear about to go to heaven? Alright. I can break it down into 4 points. On the one side, there's God, and He's perfect and good. We've talked about that. And yet, on the other side, there's us. And we all know what we're like. We're not perfect and good. We're separated from the goodness that God is. And then we have Jesus, and the idea that Jesus died to be punished in our place for the bad things that we did instead of us. It's called vicarious atonement, which means which means like he makes us at one with God by being in our place. In other words, the punishment that we deserve went on to Jesus Christ. Okay? So you could say God, this is the way I sum it up, God good, man bad, Jesus saves. And then believe to receive. In other words, how does what Jesus has done for you, how does that apply to you? Well, it applies to you by believing it, by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. You know, so like I can give you a Bible verse, right? Romans 10:9. For if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Right? So there you go. And I think in Romans 10:13 says, everyone who calls in the name of the Lord shall be saved. But also there's John 7:17. Well, before we move on to John 7, I want you to think about that. There's 4 points there. God good, man bad, Jesus saves, believe to receive. Think about that. The first 2 points are the problem, and the second 2 points are the solution. So the first point, there's a God, and then you're separated from God, God good, man bad, and then it moves on to the solution to the problem. Jesus saves us by what He did, and to receive that, you have to believe it. So here's the thing. What if everyone knows about the problem? Then, in that situation, would it make a difference? Would you really need everyone to know about the solution? You see what I'm saying? So, in other words, like, let's just imagine hypothetically, theoretically, for the time being, that everyone finds out about the God good, man bad part, the problem. Some people will not be willing to accept that the problem exists and will be in denial about the problem. For those people, there's not really necessarily much point in them finding out about the solution to a problem that they won't admit that they have. So the only people you really need to make sure find out about Jesus are the people who are willing to be honest about the problem. Of course, God could see to it that, you know, other people find out about the problem even though they're still in denial about it. You know, but as far as for our question of the unevangelized, if everyone finds out about the problem, that's the first step of evangelism. But you would only need to explain the solution to the problem to people who are willing to admit the problem exists. And this is actually a promise Jesus makes in John 7:17. Or we'll start in verse 16. Jesus says, and they're questioning Jesus again, in John 7. And he says in verse 16, Jesus answered, "My teaching is not my own, it comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own." So look at that. If you really want to follow God, which means there's no way you could say, I really want to follow God, and not also sit back and say, but I've done bad things. Because as soon as, the reason people, all of us are, even myself included, are in denial about the fact that we are bad people and have done bad things is because we don't even try to do the right thing. And when you try to be a good person, you immediately find out about your failure and your lacking, the fact that you lack it, that you're not cutting it. And so what Jesus says is that anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out about whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. So in other words, if you really follow God, you'll find out the truth about Jesus. It's a blatant promise there. So what that means is, like, Jesus is making a promise that some way, somehow. And think of it, God could send a missionary. He could do all sorts of things. I heard one story of a man who was in China and he worshipped multiple gods, and there was a group of Christians who lived near him, and one of their chants or songs, a piece of paper that had the words on it, had fallen to the ground, and all it had on there, it was just a little fragment of paper, and all it had on there, it said, "Are there many gods? No, there is only one." And on the basis of that, that guy said, "You know what? I got the story from Dallas Willard's book, Renovation of the Heart." But anyway, he said, on the basis of this piece of paper, I'm going to smash all my idols and only believe in one God. So that's what he does. And then, his daughter gets sick, really sick, and is going to die. And so all the community tells him, well, it's because you smashed all your idols and you've angered the gods. And so that's why your daughter's dying. The guy didn't know what to do. So he figures that if he goes to the top of the tallest mountain where he lives and hollers as loud as he can, God will hear his request to heal his daughter. And so he goes up there and he makes that request, and his daughter's healed. He just if the one God I believe in, if you're there, save my daughter. His daughter's healed. And so then he goes on a search to find out who this one God is, and he eventually discovers the Christians that live near him, and he becomes a missionary. Okay? Here's another story that Ravi Zacharias tells, but it makes the point in a similar way, that God will send a missionary. Ravi Zacharias tells this story. He says, during the Vietnam War, Ravi Zacharias was a missionary to Vietnam. And there was a Vietnamese Christian man who was his translator. I think he spoke French and Vietnamese and English, and he could read all of those. And so Ravi spoke English, and I'm sure he spoke Hindi, and because he's from India. And so Ravi was a missionary during this war. Well, anyway, long story short, America lost the Vietnam War, and it became a communist country. So a communist country is a country that where it's a totalitarian form of government that it's illegal to be religious. You have to be atheist by law. Okay. Now, in a communist country like that, someone like Hien, who had been a missionary and that kind of thing, he actually was sent to prison. And he said the prisons were terrible, and he said they wouldn't allow him to read anything in English, the language of the enemy Americans, and he could only read communist atheist literature in French and in Vietnamese. And he said one day he had to read it, and he was reading something about how the communist man was like a man in a cage, and how capitalism was the cage, and he needs to shake the cage and break free of the cage and accept communism, and of course atheism as well, and then he'll be free from the prison bars of his capitalist religion, and all that. And so he decided, you know what, I'm going to be an atheist, and I'm not going to pray today. I'm done believing in God. He was given latrine duty, and he said the latrines were awful. They were the nastiest place he'd ever been. But he was given latrine duty, and he he saw in the poopy paper, and like the waste paper, and the toilet paper, and the used toilet paper, a copy of some. It had words on it, and it had English words on it. So he quickly like got it and cleaned the poopy off and put it in his pocket because he, it had English on it and he wanted to read some English. He hadn't read English in years, and everything was in Vietnamese and French. And he said that night under his mosquito net, he looked at it and it said it was a page from the Bible and it said Romans chapter 8. And he said he started reading it, and when he got down to verse 28, and it's where it says, "For all things work together for the good of those that are love the Lord and are called according to His purpose," he said he broke down and he cried right there. And he prayed, and he said, "You know what, God, you wouldn't let me go one day without praying to you." And he said he asked for latrine duty after that every day. And what he found out was there was one of the officers at the prison had been given a copy of the Bible, and so he was using it for toilet paper. And so this guy Hien was collecting the whole Bible, the whole book of Romans, I think, through the toilet paper thing. Okay. Eventually he got released from prison, and him and some other people were going to get a boat and leave Vietnam and escape as refugees. And some soldiers came by his house right when they were getting ready, they were going to leave, in a few days. And they said, "We heard you're going to leave. Is that true?" And of course he didn't want to go back to prison, so he lied to them, and he told them that we're not leaving. And he felt guilty about it because he had lied, and he said, "God, all this that you brought me through, and I still won't trust you. I know the Bible says I shouldn't tell lies." And so he said he prayed a prayer that he hoped God would never take him up on. He said, "If they come back, I promise, I'll tell the truth." And he said those guys came back like the day before they were going to leave, and they asked him again. The soldiers came back, and he told them the truth, and he said, "Yeah, we got a boat. We're going to leave like tomorrow." They grabbed him and took him back into a room, private, closed the door, and said, "We want to go with you." And he said that if it was not for the skill of those men, those soldiers, with handling a boat on the high seas, they would have all drowned. Okay, so those stories illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here, that if someone is willing to be honest about the problem, then God can find a way to send them the message, whether it's a scrap of paper or however. God may send you. Who knows what God might send? There's radio waves. There's so many ways that people find out about Jesus. God may, you may be like Michael Ramsden and your parents get a job in a different country, So anyway, the real question is, all right, Ben, how can everyone know about the problem? Well, one step of the problem, maybe not the first step, but one step of the problem is like your own life, like the things you've done in your life and the bad things you've done. And so like that's kind of obvious to everyone. You definitely, we're all conscious of the fact that we've done bad things. So like, that part's easy. The real question is it possible for people to know how the graveness of their sin and how bad that is, and have a sense that like we're separated from God and destined to hell? So the question is, can we know God exists? Is that knowledge available to everyone? Because if it is, then that would be a game changer. Well, let's take a look. Romans, one of the more famous verses here is, of course, Romans chapter 1. Starting in verse 18, it says, basically what I've been saying. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So in other words, every bit of evil that everyone's done, the wrath of God is being revealed. In other words, the fact that we're separated from God and destined for hell is being revealed, according to Paul right here. in Romans 1. And you say, well, how is it being revealed? And he says how. Since what may be known about God is plain. In other words, the fact that we're separated from the goodness of God is plain to us because we all know about God. He says God has made it plain to them. He says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, in other words, you can't see God and God's qualities are invisible. But then he says, so what are those invisible qualities? It's God's eternal power and his divine nature. The word divine means God, his godlike nature, or just the fact that in his essence of his being, he's God. That's what that means. Okay, his nature. Your nature is a human nature, so God's nature is a God nature. God is God. Okay, so those are invisible qualities of God, and he says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So in other words, since the creation of the world, you can tell that God's God, who God really is, and what he is like, from the things God has made. Well, the things God made is everything. Okay? And he says, so that people are without excuse. That everyone has no excuse. Because, and the word there is excuse, it's a translation of the Greek word apologetic. In other words, you have, and it means like a legal defense, a legal argument, a persuasive logic, basically. So, apologia. Now, in Romans 10, it makes a similar point. It says, in verse 13, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. We talked about that verse a little while ago. Then it goes on in verse 14, it says, but how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Now it's interesting because in Romans 10, Paul's talking about Israelites. And so he says this like, how can they know about Jesus if no one preaches about Jesus to them? But then he says, but wait a minute. He's talking about Israelites here. Of all people, they know. He says, but not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? So he says, consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. Okay, yeah, we follow. And then he goes on in verse 18 and he says, but I ask, did they not hear? Of course they did. And then he quotes Psalm 19. He says, their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. So that's Psalm 19. Right? And it says this. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. So according to the Bible, everyone knows about the problem. Now the question is, well, in other words, the problem is really the key to understanding the problem of sin is understanding that God exists and what God is like. According to the Bible, the heavens declare the glory of God. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, but their voice goes out into all the earth. So, here's the question for us. How is it possible that this is true? Well, what the Bible's doing is it's telling us how to prove God exists. It says you can see proof for God's existence and tell that there must be a God and what he's like by looking at the things God has created. That's what Paul said in Romans 1, from what has been made. Well, here's the issue. God created everything. God created you. The Bible in Genesis 1 says that God created you in God's image, that you are like a painting of God himself. Okay. Well, Christians have taken the time to go back and investigate, look at the world, and just take these verses seriously and say, okay, how is it possible for us to know that there's a God? Well, it's interesting. Even before Christianity, Greeks who didn't believe in the Bible had used reasoning and logic to come to believe that there must be a supreme God. And so, like, for example, they had all, the philosophers of Greece and Rome had come to believe that there's one God. And they had a lot of debates in that world about what God is really like. There were a lot of holes from the feeling, but they understood that there was one God based on their philosophical arguments and reasoning and logical arguments. Over the centuries, we've actually come up with multiple ways to prove God exists. So you want to check it out, go to my Proof God Exists playlist. What I'm going to go through for you right now is just one of those proofs. And it works like this. A simple example, this is called the moral argument for God's existence. And a simple example would be, everyone, I don't care who you are, I don't care if you're Joseph Stalin and an atheist, or whoever you are, you know that, like, some things are wrong. You don't know everything there is to know about what's right and what's wrong. Nobody does. But we know some stuff. Like, we know that, like, if here's a grisly example. If you were to, like, take a baby and, like, cut it up with a knife and, like, batter it up in salt and flour and fry it in the frying pan, that would be morally evil. That would be evil. Okay? Or something like maybe rape. You know, Ravi Zacharias tells another story where this woman, she's a Dutch social worker, and she rescues little girls from rape. And she said she had to rip an 18-month-old baby girl from the arms of, it was in Cambodia, but she had to rescue an 18-month-old baby girl from the arms of a man who was sexually, raping that girl. And so most people are have a hard time, denying that that's evil. Okay, so here's the question. Since we all know that some things are evil, how could it be that there is such a thing as good and evil? How is that possible? I mean, why does it matter what someone does? What difference does it make? You can't have good and evil unless you have somebody. So like you could, in other words, like, let's think of it this way. Look at any object in the room you're in, just a physical object like, a rock or something. Does a rock, the Aristotle, the philosopher, one of the philosophers that came up with one of these arguments for God's existence, called the first cause argument, he said nothing is what rocks dream about. That was his definition of nothing. It's what rocks dream about. And so the issue is, like, do rocks care what you do with your life? To a rock, is it good or bad, anything you do? No. Rocks have no desires, no hope, no will about the way things should be or should not be. You can't get a concept of good and evil. You can't get good and evil. You can't get it without somebody, without a being, a personal being, someone. It can't come from something. It has to come from someone. And so what this means is morality has to come from somebody. Now you could say, well, people make morality. But the problem is like, well, what if, like, the Nazis had won World War II and killed everyone who disagreed with them? And the Nazis were like, they were racist who said, if you're not, white, blonde hair, blue-eyed, then we're going to kill you. Well, what if everyone in the whole world agreed with them? And they killed off everyone who disagreed with them? Then would the racist ways of the Nazis, would that suddenly be morally correct just because there wasn't even one to say it was wrong? Most of us are going to agree that that's evil, no matter what. Or you could take the example of, murdering babies. If everyone in the world said murdering babies was okay, would that make it okay? Most of us are going to understand that, like, no, it's evil regardless of, like, what anyone says. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if humans make morality, then, like, which human? Because different humans have different ideas and different societies have different ideas. So that's a major problem with that. So what we say is the only way you can have morality is if you have an absolute moral lawgiver, a being who is the ultimate foundation of what is good and evil. And we've gotten back to what I talked about with God already, right? That God is the bedrock, the foundation of goodness itself. Okay, so we just proved that God exists. If you agree that some things are evil, then logically, therefore, God must exist. Now, the question that arises from this is like, well, what if some people, out there, I mean, how does every, yeah, you follow my reasoning and you may even agree with me. But a lot of people never heard that. So, like, does that really, is that like what the Bible's talking about where it says the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands? Is that, this philosophical reasoning is all well and good, but like, does it help everyone? Yes, it does. Think about it this way. The Bible is telling us that absolutely everything you've ever seen is proof for God's existence. I just gave you one little proof for God's existence. But according to the Bible, there's more. That it's everywhere. It's all around you. Alright, so let's think of an example. I remember one time my family went to Disney World, and when they came, and they went to Universal Studios, and they talked about Universal Studios, I think, more than Disney World. But like, they were just blown away with, the trip, and they were just so excited when they came back, just telling me about it, and how amazing it was, and I needed to hear about it. And I could feel that, like, I could see the excitement and the wonder, and there was something they were trying to tell me, but I could tell, they weren't quite connecting. Like, there's no way I really understood what the experience was like for them. And the problem was, either A, they don't know what the experience was like, and that's why they can't tell me, or B, it's just difficult to communicate. And I think that it's obvious that the answer is B. I mean, they were just there. They know what, they know what it was like, but it's very difficult to communicate things like that sometimes. Sometimes life is overwhelming, and sometimes the more you know about something and the more overwhelming the knowledge is, the more difficult it is to share. So think about it this way. If every single thing you've experienced in life ever demonstrates that there must be a God, then it would probably be very difficult to communicate that. And so what you would have is a bunch of people who believe in God but don't really quite understand why, but it just sort of seems obvious to them, but they're not real sure why they believe. So here's the point. That's where Christian philosophers come in, because what we do is we try to go in and figure out how to communicate it, just a piece of it. And that's where we get these proofs for God's existence. I just gave you one, but there's actually much more. Now, moving on, what this means is we've kind of solved the problem, right? I mean, everyone knows that God exists, has access to the knowledge, and there you have it. Not everyone necessarily would, hear about Jesus, but we've answered all that. But then the question is like, well, it seems like God doesn't really necessarily need you and me to go tell people about Jesus. I mean, God could tell people about Jesus, without you and me. What is our role in evangelism and going and telling people about Jesus Christ? So some preachers say, and so this is why I'm bringing this up, some preachers actually preach from their pulpit that if you don't go preach to someone, that person will never hear about Jesus, and so they'll never have an opportunity to go to heaven, and they'll go to hell because you never preached to them. And I kid you not, I've heard preachers who preach that, and they preach that, like, the age of accountability, that all the babies would go to heaven. So the babies get a pass, but once you're past the age of accountability, you don't get a pass even if you've never heard about Jesus. Amazing, huh? So I mean, it's like they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? So the bottom line is, like, God could send someone else. If someone needs to hear about Jesus, God doesn't need you. He doesn't need you. He could send someone else. I gave you two stories where people really, God reached them through like scraps of paper. God doesn't need us. In fact, look at how God reached Paul. Ultimately, in the end, God reached Paul miraculously on the road to Damascus. I'm sure Paul knew about Jesus. He'd heard the story of Jesus. But really, the real evangelist, the missionary that was sent to Paul, was Jesus. Paul had a vision of the resurrected Christ, and that's what made the difference for Paul. That was when, and it didn't take much. It was just one final little word from Jesus, because apparently Paul had heard a lot. But then Paul goes on to say that angels came and ministered to him. You know, after he left, I think after he left Damascus, it talks about in Galatians, he learned the gospel message of Jesus Christ directly from, I think, from Jesus and the angels. And he says then he went later to the humans, to Peter and them, and he said nothing he preached contradicted anything they said. And Peter even wrote in one of his letters, you know, some of the stuff Paul writes is difficult to understand. He commends people to read Paul's letters because Paul is correct. But some of the stuff Paul writes is difficult to understand, and he says there are some people who try to distort what Paul says, which is wrong. All right, so this is amazing. So then the question becomes, well, if God doesn't need me, then why even evangelize the people? Why go share the story of Jesus? And so this is the answer I try to give to this, is what I call shake and bake evangelism. When I was a kid, they used to have these commercials that came on TV for this thing called shake and bake. And shake and bake was like a way to make fried chicken without having to fry chicken. So fried chicken, you put flour and salt. You salt the chicken, you put flour on it, and then you get the oil up to 365 and you drop it in there. And it takes a long time, but when it comes out, it's all fried. Shake and bake is like this bag, and you put these like seasoning stuff in this bag, and you put the chicken in the bag, and you hold the bag closed and you shake it. And then you put the chicken on a pan in the oven and you bake it. And that's called shake and bake. It doesn't taste like fried chicken, sad to say. But it's an easy way to make chicken. And on the commercial, the little girl, there's like a little girl helping her mom cook. And the little girl is given the bag. Mama puts the chicken in the bag and puts the seasoning in the bag, and she gives it to the little girl and says, okay, you shake it. And the little girl shakes the bag. She shakes it real good with all her heart. And then she gives it back to Mama, who puts it in the oven and finishes supper. And then when it's supper time, everyone's enjoying the supper, and they're like, what is this chicken? It's so delicious. And the little girl jumps in, and instead of the mama saying, oh, I fixed this, I bought this, and I bought shake and bake and we fixed it, the little girl just jumps in and she says, it's shake and bake and I helped. So that's a good way to illustrate, I think, the point that we need to understand here is that the reason the little girl wanted to do it is because she felt special and important and excited to be part of it. And that's really the attitude that we need to have when it comes to evangelism. We need to feel excited to be part of what God's doing. Think about any little toddler, little 6-year-old like that. You're excited that you're helping out. And the fact that you're not really all that necessary, and that your dad or your mom could do it without you, that doesn't deter you at all from wanting to be involved as much as possible and do everything you can. In fact, the main reason why you want to do it is because it's some big cool thing that mommy or daddy's doing and you just want to be part of it. Okay? But the problem is like, we don't evangelize often because we have some sort of paranoid anxiety, or we're not really worshiping God in love with God, and so we don't get excited about being part of what God's doing, or we're paranoid that we'll mess up somehow, which I hate to say, but if these people go out saying that, like, if you don't preach to them, then they'll go to hell because you didn't preach to them, Well, that makes people paranoid, and that actually probably makes people less likely to evangelize if they really take that seriously, because they could say, well, what if I preach Jesus incorrectly? Then I could have the same result. They won't go to heaven because of my bad preaching. So that paranoid anxiety, or just a lack of worship and love for God, will create a lack of evangelism. And so the solution is to grow closer to God on the inside, instead of, being threatened with some guilt. So finally, let's get to the question we started with. What about babies? I mean, the question is like, okay, well, what about babies? I mean, God can send a missionary to someone in some faraway place, but what about babies? I mean, no one can talk to a baby. Babies don't know how to talk yet. No one can send a missionary. They can't read. Nothing. Here's my question. Can God communicate with the baby without you? He communicated with Paul. In fact, think about this. Just because none of us will ever talk to him, why should we think that God can't? It's God we're talking about here. And you know what it says in the Bible? It says that absolutely everyone who becomes a Christian has to have God talk to them directly. John 6 is a long sermon on the plain, right? Where Jesus preached a sermon on the mount, he gains followers. He preaches a sermon on the plain, and he starts losing followers. But sermon on the plain, Jesus says, in John 6, verse 44, he says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them, and I will raise them up at the last day." In other words, you can't come to Jesus unless you're drawn by God. What do you mean, drawn by God? He says in verse 45, he actually quotes the Old Testament. He says, "It is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me." Let's see if I can look up that quotation. Isaiah 54:13. Okay, so in other words, you can't even become a Christian unless God speaks to you about Jesus, without any humans involved. And so, not only could babies, be preached to by God directly, everyone has to be preached to by God directly. There's nothing unique about the baby situation except that, like, we aren't involved in the part, and we don't get to play a role in it. So, like, here's a question. Maybe it's none of our business. You know what I mean? Like, just because we aren't involved, we should be lucky. We should feel excited and lucky to ever have any involvement ever. And the fact that in some people's lives we don't get to play a role. Well, how dare we act like it's all game over because we're not involved? And that's really the arrogance sometimes that's inherent in this question. People say, like, well, they aren't preached to. No, they're preached to, because no one becomes a Christian unless God preaches to them directly. Jesus said they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me. So it's just because it's really arrogant to say that, like, well, a baby can't be preached to by some human, then you can't become a Christian. Not what the Bible says. The Bible says no one can become a Christian unless they hear from God directly. That's how no one can become a Christian. They don't need you. They need God. And the reason why we evangelize is because we feel privileged and excited to be part of what God is doing in someone's life. So the short answer to the question, do babies go to heaven or hell, is depends on what they choose. Just like with anything else, with anyone else. You say, well, like, why would God take them out of this world so early? Well, why would God take any of us out of this world whenever He does? It's up to God. We don't know that. We don't know what God's plan is for everyone's life. He has a different plan for everyone's life. And you say, well, it makes me really upset that like my baby, maybe my baby in my baby's young form rejected God, rejected Jesus Christ and the offer of salvation. You know, can babies sin? Well, yeah, they can hate. They have the full range. They're human beings. They have the full range of human emotions. It may be very simple, but God can, God could definitely communicate with them when we're talking about God here. So, here's the thing. Lots of people die every day. And I hate to say it, but I've had friends who had parents who weren't Christians. And they made it clear they weren't Christians, and then their parents died. How do you think they feel? So, it's a little bit rude to the people that are going through that. That's another question that, we could come up with. Like, well, why do, how do we deal with, like, the fact that people go to hell, And, I guess this will be our final question, is, like, it's not even in my notes, but, like, am I going to be in heaven and, like, my loved ones aren't going to be there? Am I going to be sad forever? Am I going to be eternally sad? And this is a question I don't know. I don't remember if I've ever dealt with it in a video, but, like, this is why I did this video, because this babies go to heaven question, it actually is a great, like, point from which we can deal with so many questions. We were talking an hour about this question because, like, it leads to so many follow-up questions. And so, who knows why God, chooses to bring someone up. I heard somewhere, and I don't remember the source, that the early church believed that babies babies die because they were too good for this world. That they were already so close to God that there was no more sanctification. Their little baby hearts were so pure, and they were good little, holy little babies that just loved God, and, like, they were ready to go on up. And that's a nice way of thinking about it, but we can't really say for sure. But what we can say is their situation really isn't any different from anyone else's. They're in the same boat we're all in, and that doesn't really seem like any different from it is for anyone else. The real question is, like, well, how do we deal with the fact that some people go to hell? Are we going to be sad forever in heaven knowing that, like, our loved ones are in hell forever? And there's more than one way to answer that. And so what I'm going to go with is a fairly simple answer that I heard on the radio a while back, is to think about it this way. God knows about all this, and God has some sort of answer for it. And while we may not understand why, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have an answer. And this is really the answer that's given in the book of Job. All this really, really bad stuff happens to this guy Job. And we, the readers, we know why it happened, because the story tells us. But Job never knows why it happened. And Job just complains, why God, why God, why? Why did all this happen to me? And his friends all come with easy, cheesy, peasy explanation of, like, this all happened because you did something bad. Good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And, of course, that's not why it happened to Job. We know that in the story. But finally, God shows up, and you think, well, okay, well, Job's been asking for like chapter after page after page after page, like, why did this happen, God? Why did this happen, God? And what God says is not an answer at all. God just says, like, 40 questions back to back. He just asked Job a bunch of questions. He's like, all right, Job, since you want to know me to explain this to you, why don't you tell me a few things first? I got a few questions for you, Job. How does this work? How does that work? What do you know about this? What do you know about that? He goes through like a billion things, and it makes it clear, like, you know what, God, I guess there's a lot I don't know. It's not just like, how do you answer this one thing? Why did this happen? Why do my loved ones wind up in hell? But a bigger question of, like, I don't understand a lot of what's going on. Think about it this way. Why should we understand what God understands? Okay? Why should we understand that? Just because we don't have an answer, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have an answer. And that's really the point in the book of Job about really like all these bad things that happen that we don't understand why. Of course we don't understand why. We're not God. We're not God. And so there you have it. We've covered such an amazing breadth of stuff in this video. That's what has always amazed me about this question. You can't really deal with this question without covering a lot of territory. And so, let's see. I've been rolling for an hour here, and I feel like we covered so many subjects that were really given a very brief answer. And really, when it comes to the question of where do babies go when they die, the answer is they go to either heaven or hell, just like everyone else. I hope this video made some sense, and I want you to know, if you've stayed with me this long, that there are other videos on this channel that will delve into different topics that we've touched on in this video with more information. And I encourage you to maybe rewind and look back over points that maybe didn't make the most sense to you. I know this is an hour-long video, but there you have it.